Blenheim Palace did not need another legend. It needed money. Behind its great stone front stood an inherited title, an enormous building, a collection, a library, gardens, wages, repairs, and bills that did not care how old the family name was. In 1895, a marriage carried a new stream of wealth into that system. The bride was Consuelo Vanderbilt, the daughter of an American railroad fortune. The groom was Charles Spencer-Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The National Portrait Gallery gives the central figure plainly. Her dowry was $2.5 million. It says that Vanderbilt money was used to restore Blenheim Palace and to replenish its furnishings and library. If stories like this are why you are here, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. That is the first answer. The palace needed her fortune, because grandeur is not the same thing as income. A title could command deference and still fail to mend a roof. A family could possess paintings, rooms, land, and ceremonial rank, while lacking enough liquid money to maintain the physical machine that made that rank visible. Consuelo did not arrive at Blenheim as a contractor. She arrived as a duchess, yet the financial instrument attached to her marriage became part of the reason the palace could be repaired and presented as a living seat of power. This is not a story in which a palace simply swallowed a woman and left no record, nor is it a story in which one document can tell us everything she thought. The surviving evidence has different voices and different limits. The National Portrait Gallery records the marriage, the money, and the work at Blenheim. Blenheim Palace records the family succession and the projects associated with the 9th Duke. Consuelo published a memoir more than half a century after the wedding. A church controversy in 1926 preserved competing claims about whether she had freely consented to the marriage. Each source answers one question and raises another. The cleanest way into the story is through the object that joined them. It was not a chest of coins pushed through a palace door. It was a settlement, a structure designed to hold capital, direct income, and bind wealth to a marriage across time. That structure is why the title of Duchess and the need of a palace could be linked without the family selling the palace itself. It is also why the language of a dowry can hide more than it reveals. Money placed in trust can be both protection and restriction. It can prevent immediate seizure while fixing who receives income, under what conditions, and for how long. Consuelo was born in 1877. By the time of her marriage, she had grown up inside one of the most visible new fortunes in the United States. The Vanderbilts represented industrial wealth that was recent in aristocratic terms, but immense in financial terms. The Marlborough title represented hereditary status that was ancient by comparison, but burdened by the cost of maintaining its material world. Their marriage did not merge two equal forms of power. It exchanged one form for another. On one side stood railroad capital. Railroads were networks of iron, schedules, securities, labor, and distance. Their value could be represented in shares and income. On the other side stood Blenheim, a palace rooted to one place. Its value was physical, symbolic, and dynastic. It could not be divided without damaging the very claim it embodied. A railroad fortune could travel in paper form. A palace could not. That difference matters. When people reduce this union to cash for a coronet, They see the bargain but miss the machinery. The marriage was not only a social exchange between an ambitious American family and a British duke. It was also a transfer between two economic systems. New industrial capital entered an old landed institution. The institution used that capital to preserve stone, rooms, books, furniture, and ceremony. The transfer became visible in the palace, even when the legal structure behind it remained abstract. It also became visible in Consuelo's public identity. She was not simply Consuelo Vanderbilt after the wedding. She became Duchess of Marlborough, a title attached to a house, a lineage, and expectations about heirs. The National Portrait Gallery records that she and the Duke had 2 sons. Their existence mattered to the succession because hereditary systems treat family life as institutional continuity. A marriage could be private in law and intimate in daily life, but for a dukedom, it was also part of the mechanism by which property, title, and memory moved forward. The difficulty is that institutional continuity can make a person look like a function: bride, heiress, duchess, mother of heirs, source of money. Each label tells us something real, but none is enough. Consuelo's story requires 2 views at once. We have to see the palace as a machine that needed cash. We also have to see the woman whose name became attached to that cash, and whose later account insisted that the marriage had not been the future she chose. The evidence does not allow us to stand beside her in every private moment. It does allow us to follow the structure around her. We can trace the family ambition that shaped the match. We can trace the Duke's need for money. We can trace the settlement. We can trace the wedding, the sons, the separation, the divorce, and the later annulment dispute. We can trace work at Blenheim. Those traces are enough to reveal a mechanism larger than gossip. Blenheim needed her fortune because inherited magnificence had operating costs. The marriage delivered wealth because Consuelo belonged to a family whose money could be converted into an income-bearing settlement. The palace changed because that income was used for restoration and replenishment. The marriage later failed as a shared union, but the physical results of the financial transfer remained. That is the central tension. The stone could outlast the arrangement that paid for it. To understand why the settlement mattered, begin with the difference between possessing a palace and being able to afford one. Blenheim was not simply a large residence. It was the visible center of the Marlborough inheritance. Its staterooms, courtyards, art, books, furniture, gardens, and approach roads announced that the family belonged to a national story. The building represented victory, royal favor, continuity, and rank. It also demanded continuous care. Stone weathers, roofs fail, water enters, paint darkens, textiles fade, books need dry rooms, furniture needs repair, gardens need labor in every season. A household requires food, heat, light, cleaning, laundry, transport, bookkeeping, and supervision. None of those needs become smaller because a house is famous. In fact, fame can make maintenance more exacting because every damaged surface threatens the image the house is meant to project. An inherited estate may contain enormous value while producing limited ready cash. Land can provide rent and agricultural income, but income changes with markets and management. A painting can be priceless and still fail to pay a mason. A ceremonial room can be impressive and still cost money when no guest is present. A library can express centuries of cultivation while needing shelves, bindings, heat, and protection from damp. The more completely a great house performs continuity, the more labor is hidden inside that performance. The Duke inherited Blenheim and its obligations. Christie's historical account describes his income as insufficient to maintain the palace and carry out the renovations he wanted. The National Portrait Gallery provides the consequence of the Vanderbilt match. It says the dowry was used to restore the palace and replenish the furnishings and library. Together, those statements show a need and an answer. They do not tell us that every expense came from a single account. They do tell us that the money associated with the marriage entered the restoration of the house. The word restore is important. Restoration is not the same as purchasing a new house. It means intervening in an existing structure whose age and significance limit what can be changed. It may involve repair, replacement, cleaning, reordering, or the recovery of an earlier design. It is work carried out under the authority of the present owner, but in conversation with the intentions of the dead. At a dynastic palace, restoration is therefore both practical and political. It decides which past will be made visible. The word replenish is equally revealing. To replenish furnishings and a library is to replace what has been lost, sold, dispersed, damaged, or allowed to decline. A room in a palace is not made convincing by walls alone. It requires objects that fit its scale and purpose. A library is not only a collection of texts, it is evidence that generations have read, collected, inherited, and preserved. When the National Portrait Gallery pairs restoration with furnishings and books, it describes more than construction. It describes the reconstruction of an aristocratic interior. This is where Consuelo's settlement becomes more than a number. $2.5 million in 1895 was not merely a large wedding gift, it was capital, capable of producing continuing income. The precise deed matters because elite families did not usually want a great fortune to disappear in one burst of spending. A settlement could preserve the principal while making income available according to stated rules. The money could support the Duke, the Duchess, and the line that followed them, depending on the terms. The structure also reflects mistrust. A settlement assumes that marriage alone is not a sufficient guarantee. Families employ trustees because spouses may disagree, die, separate, borrow, or spend. Heirs may be minors. Creditors may appear. A document written before a wedding tries to govern circumstances that do not yet exist. It converts affection, ambition, fear, and dynastic planning into clauses. We do not need to pretend that every clause of the Vanderbilt settlement is visible in the institutional summaries. It is enough to understand the kind of machine a settlement was. Official British legal debates later explained that married women's property could be held separately and that settlements sometimes restricted a woman's ability to anticipate future income. Such restraints had originally been defended as protection against pressure from a husband. Over time, they could also look like another limit placed on a married woman's financial freedom. Protection and control could inhabit the same instrument. That double character is central to Consuelo's story. Her father's money gave the marriage extraordinary financial power. A formal structure could prevent the entire capital sum from becoming the Duke's private property at once. Yet the arrangement still tied money, status, and family expectations together. the settlement made it possible for the Marlborough household to benefit from American wealth while keeping the transfer inside a dynastic plan. The palace, therefore, did not need Consuelo in the simple sense that one person personally paid every invoice. It needed the wealth that her family attached to her marriage. The distinction protects the truth without shrinking the consequence. Her name was not incidental to the transfer. Without the match, the settlement would not have entered the Marlborough system in the same form. This is why the material survival of Blenheim can carry an uncomfortable history. Visitors see a palace restored under a duke. The record shows that the restoration depended in part on money bound to a bride. The work can be admired as craftsmanship, while the arrangement that financed it remains open to moral examination. Beauty does not cancel the conditions under which money moved, nor do those conditions make every repaired stone fraudulent. The house is both an artistic achievement and a financial document. Great houses often invite us to look upward. Ceilings, towers, facades, and long perspectives are designed to control the eye. The settlement asks us to look downward and behind. Who supplied the cash? Which income paid the workers? Which family accepted the exchange? Which person became the bridge between systems? Once those questions are asked, Blenheim appears differently. It is still a palace. It is also the fixed endpoint of mobile American capital. Consuelo's family name carried wealth, but wealth did not erase hierarchy. The Vanderbilts had accumulated a fortune through shipping and railroads. Their money could purchase houses, travel, art, clothing, and entry into rooms that had once excluded them. Yet the oldest social circles could still treat industrial wealth as recent and therefore inferior. New money might be larger than old money and still seek the recognition that old titles seem to confer. Alva Vanderbilt understood social position as something that could be built. Her own world had shown that architecture, entertaining, marriage, and publicity could work together. A house could make a claim. A ball could test whether that claim had been accepted. A daughter's marriage could extend the claim across the Atlantic. In the institutional biographies, Alva appears as an ambitious mother whose plans shaped Consuelo's prospects. That description is not a complete psychological portrait. It is enough to establish that the match was not simply the result of two young people meeting without pressure from the structures around them. Consuelo later told the story of her upbringing in The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952. A memoir is a crucial source because it gives the subject a voice. It is also a late source. The writer knows how the story ended. She chooses which scenes to preserve and what meaning to assign them. Memory can be exact in one detail and reshaped in another. The responsible approach is neither to dismiss her account nor to repeat every remembered moment as if it were a court transcript. In that later account, Consuelo remembered asserting that she had a right to choose her own husband. The sentence has become central because it gives a clear form to the conflict. Her claim was about choice. The family project was about alliance. The two were not necessarily compatible. The National Portrait Gallery says her objection to the match was overruled. It also says she was reported to have cried throughout the wedding day. English Heritage repeats that she reportedly wept behind her veil. Christie's describes the public signs of distress that observers believed they saw. The word reportedly matters. We do not need to enter her mind to understand that resistance formed part of the historical record. We also do not need to turn a report into a cinematic close view of every tier. When a later culture tells the story, it often assigns simple roles. Alva becomes pure ambition. The Duke becomes pure calculation. Consuelo becomes pure victimhood. Those roles contain evidence, but they can flatten people into symbols. Alva's ambition was real enough to be documented. The Duke's financial need is supported by the history of Blenheim. Consuelo's objection is recorded. Yet the history must still leave room for changes over time. Mixed motives, adaptation, duty, and actions that do not fit a single label. The more useful question is not whether everyone possessed only one motive. It is how the institution rewarded certain motives and suppressed others. A transatlantic aristocratic marriage offered status to an American family. It offered money to a British title. It offered a young woman a public position that could be presented as extraordinary. It also made her preference only one element in a negotiation involving family reputation, property, and succession. English Heritage estimates that more than 400 wealthy American women married into the British aristocracy around the turn of the century. That number explains why Consuelo's marriage was part of a pattern. It does not prove that every match followed the same path. The same institution now cautions that some women married for love, some were not wealthier than their husbands, and many built public lives that outgrew the insulting label applied to them. The phrase "dollar princess" is therefore useful only if we also examine what it hides. The label turns a person into a currency and a title. Dollar on one side, princess on the other. It compresses a marriage into a market exchange and encourages the audience to treat the woman as the coin passed between families. That compression can reveal the cruelty of the system, but it can also repeat it. If Consuelo is remembered only as the money that saved Blenheim, history performs the same reduction that made her marriage valuable. Her story needs the full contradiction. She was linked to one of the largest fortunes of her era. She also described a struggle over personal choice. She became a duchess with access to ceremony, influence, and a famous house. She also entered a union later marked by separation, divorce, and annulment. She became the mother of the Marlborough heirs. She later built a life beyond the marriage. None of those statements cancels another. The mother and daughter relationship sits at the center because family authority could act where law and contract alone could not. The settlement could direct money, but it could not create a willing bride. Social power worked through dependence, reputation, access, and emotional pressure inside a household. These forms of power rarely leave records as neat as a bank instrument. That is why the later annulment dispute became so important. It tried to translate the question of consent into legal and religious terms decades after the wedding. At the time of the match, however, the public could see only fragments: engagement notices, wedding preparations, clothing, crowds, cartoons, and society reports made the event into spectacle. The bride's name was already valuable news. The Duke's title gave the story international scale. The settlement figure added a number large enough to make the marriage look like a public transaction. Private resistance and public ceremony occupied the same day. That collision between spectacle and choice is not a decorative part of the story. It explains why the settlement, the palace, and the bride cannot be separated. The same event that produced money for Blenheim also produced a story about a young woman whose preference had been overruled. The restored palace and the contested marriage are two outcomes of one arrangement. Across the Atlantic, the Duke represented a kind of status that American wealth could not manufacture quickly. A fortune could build a mansion and commission a portrait. It could not invent centuries of recognized succession. A dukedom came with a place in the social order, a name repeated in political history, and a house that seemed to make ancestry visible. To marry into that world was to acquire a title whose value depended on collective belief. But belief alone did not heat Blenheim. It did not bind books or replace damaged fabric. The title's power and the house's weakness existed together. This is one reason transatlantic marriages were possible. Each side possessed what the other lacked. The American family could offer mobile capital. The British family could offer inherited rank. The bride carried one into the other. Calling that exchange equal would be misleading. The families could negotiate money and status, but Consuelo's own position within the negotiation was not equal to theirs. Her objection could be overruled. The Duke also lived inside obligation. He had inherited a house that defined his public role, and a succession that demanded continuation. His financial motive was not separate from duty as he understood it. Yet duty to a house does not answer the question of duty to a person. The word duty can make coercive structures sound noble. It can also describe a genuine burden. A duke could believe that preserving Blenheim was not merely personal vanity but stewardship. A mother could believe that a ducal marriage gave her daughter unmatched position. A father could use a settlement to provide wealth while trying to control its destination. Each participant could describe the arrangement as responsible. The result could still deny the bride the choice she later said she wanted. This is why a system's history needs more than villains. Systems become powerful when ordinary virtues are recruited into them. Prudence produces trustees. Duty produces pressure. Continuity produces heirs. Stewardship produces restoration. Family concern produces control. Public admiration produces spectacle. The final arrangement may be harmful even when each participant uses a respectable word. At Blenheim, continuity was physical. The palace announced that the Marlborough line had endured. A duke who allowed the house to decay risked more than discomfort. He risked making decline visible. Restoration, therefore, protected authority as well as architecture. A repaired stateroom told visitors that the family remained capable. A replenished library told them that culture had not been dispersed. Furnishings restored scale and ceremony. Gardens extended order across the land. The settlement made those claims affordable. Yet the money did not carry its history on the surface. A restored chair does not announce the deed that financed it. A repaired wall does not name a reluctant bride. Once wealth becomes stone, cloth, paper, and landscape, the human conditions of transfer can disappear. This is one reason the archive matters. Documents return names and terms to objects that otherwise look timeless. Blenheim Archives describes a large body of papers associated with the ninth Duke. It also notes correspondence that includes a letter from Alva to Consuelo. The existence of such records reminds us that institutional history survives unevenly. We may know that a letter exists without claiming what an unseen page says. We may know that accounts were kept without having every invoice before us. Honest narration marks that limit. The visible house and the invisible document, therefore, work as paired evidence. The house proves that work was done. The institutional record links Vanderbilt wealth to restoration, furnishings, and the library. The settlement explains how capital could enter the household. The surviving family papers show that administrators recorded the world around the marriage. None of this gives us direct access to every private conversation. It gives us the structure that made those conversations consequential. The structure also helps us avoid a common mistake. It is tempting to say that Consuelo bought Blenheim. She did not. The palace remained the seat of the Marlborough family. It is tempting to say that the Duke simply received $2.5 million as personal spending money. The language of settlement and trust is more complicated. It is tempting to say that every later work at the palace came from the original marriage fund. The evidence does not permit that calculation. What can be said is precise and substantial. The dowry was used to restore Blenheim and replenish its furnishings and library. Precision strengthens the story. The truth is already dramatic. A young American woman's marriage was attached to enough capital to alter one of Britain's greatest houses. Her name entered the building's financial history, even as public descriptions often reduced her to an heiress. The palace needed wealth that its title could not supply. The Vanderbilt family wanted rank that wealth alone could not create. The settlement converted those needs into a durable arrangement. The arrangement also created repayment obligations for anyone telling the story. If we use the palace as spectacle, we must explain the money. If we use Consuelo's reported distress, we must explain the limits of the evidence. If we call the marriage a transaction, we must show the instrument. If we call the palace saved or restored, we must identify what the sources actually say. The result is not a fairy tale with a dark turn. It is an institutional history in which beauty, power, law, and personal choice were fastened together. That fastening began before the wedding. The settlement had to be planned before the ceremony, because the marriage changed legal and family relationships. Trustees, income, succession, and conditions could not be improvised after vows. The document made the future legible to the families in advance. It tried to answer who would benefit, who would control, and what would happen after death. What it could not answer was whether the people joined by it would make a life together. Marriage settlements belong to a world in which property and family were inseparable. Today, a wedding contract may sound like an exception, something used only when people expect failure. In elite dynastic life, settlement was closer to infrastructure. It organized wealth before marriage altered rights, names, households, and inheritance. It could protect a daughter's income, provide for a husband, secure children, limit creditors, and keep capital attached to a line. The official British discussion of married women's property helps explain the paradox. By the end of the 19th century, a married woman could hold separate property under statute, yet lawyers continued to use settlement devices that restricted anticipation of future income. The restriction had once been defended as a way to protect a wife from pressure to surrender her resources. Later critics saw it as an outdated limit on her autonomy. The same clause could therefore be described as a shield and a lock. We should not project every general legal device into the Vanderbilt deed without the deed before us. The point is not to invent clauses. It is to understand why the word settlement matters. $2.5 million could be placed into an arrangement that produced income and survived the first moment of marriage. Trustees could stand between the capital and either spouse. The marriage connected the families, while the document specified the financial path. That path is what made an American fortune useful to an inherited palace. Blenheim did not need only a dramatic payment, it needed continuing capacity. Repairs and staffing recur. Collections require long care. Gardens consume labor year after year. A stream of income is often more useful to an estate than a single pile of cash, because it can be planned against future obligations. Income also creates dependence. Whoever receives it must live within the rules that produce it. The Duke's access to Vanderbilt wealth came through marriage. Consuelo's position as Duchess came through the same union. Their children would connect the financial arrangement to the future of the title. A settlement did not sit outside family life. It shaped what family life meant materially. This is where the phrase marriage market becomes more than metaphor. A market does not require a public price tag on every person. It requires parties comparing assets, risks, expectations, and returns. The Duke's title and palace had social value. Consuelo's family wealth had financial value. Her youth, lineage, and ability to produce heirs were treated as dynastic value. The families could speak the language of suitability, while the settlement translated suitability into money. The exchange did not make Consuelo passive in every part of her later life. It did make her preference vulnerable at the point when the arrangement was formed. The NPG record says her objection was overruled. Her later memoir framed the conflict as a right to choose. Those two sources are enough to establish that consent cannot be assumed merely because the wedding took place. The later annulment adds another layer. In 1926, the public explanation reported for the church decree was that parental pressure had been exercised and that the bride had not acted of her own free consent. The Episcopal Bishop of New York fiercely contested that conclusion. He argued that clergy associated with the original ceremony believed she had consented and that the later claim arrived too late. His text is valuable precisely because it is partisan. It shows that consent was not only a private question, it became an institutional conflict between churches, courts, public memory, and the people involved. One source says pressure. Another says the ceremony was valid. Consuelo's later account describes resistance. A careful history does not erase the disagreement by choosing the most vivid version and presenting it as a camera recording. It lays out the record. The objection was documented. The later decree was reportedly based on lack of free consent. The Episcopal bishop disputed that basis. The marriage remained a civil fact long enough to produce children, separation, and divorce before the religious annulment. This difference between civil fact and moral certainty is crucial. A legal marriage can exist even when later testimony raises serious questions about pressure. An annulment can make a religious judgment without rewriting every civil consequence. A memoir can preserve the subject's voice without becoming a perfect transcript. History often survives in overlapping systems that do not agree. The settlement was one of those systems. It could remain effective even if the relationship deteriorated. Money does not require affection once rules direct it. A trust can continue while spouses live apart. A palace can benefit from an arrangement after the human bond at its center has weakened. That is why the stone outlasted the marriage. The instrument also protected the dynastic logic of the transaction. A duke needed heirs. A settlement could account for heirs. A family providing wealth wanted terms. The trustees gave those terms continuity. No one had to reopen the negotiation every time the household paid a bill. The financial structure continued in the background, quiet and impersonal. For the viewer, the document is less visually impressive than Blenheim. There is no grand facade in a clause, yet the settlement is the true machine of the story. It connected railroad securities to palace repairs. It converted a daughter's marriage into estate income. It protected capital from immediate disappearance, while binding that capital to conditions. It allowed the old house to draw strength from new money without surrendering the title that made the exchange attractive. When we say Blenheim needed her fortune, this is what the sentence means. The house required financial power that its own inheritance did not supply in sufficient form. Consuelo's marriage brought access to that power. The settlement was the pipe through which it flowed. The human question is what it cost to make her the connection. The wedding took place at St. Thomas's Church in New York on the 6th of November, 1895. It was a religious ceremony, a civil event, a society spectacle, and the activation point of a financial arrangement. Those layers did not occur one after another. They occupied the same hour. Christie's account describes crowds outside the church and police managing the scene. The marriage had been presented to the public as an event of exceptional importance. A Vanderbilt daughter was becoming a Duchess. The title traveled well in a newspaper headline. So did the settlement figure. The public could understand the match before it knew either person. American fortune, British rank, young bride, great palace. That simple frame gave the press a story it could repeat. Every detail of dress, arrival, guest, and ceremony became evidence of magnificence. Yet reports of the bride's distress circulated beside the celebration. The National Portrait Gallery says she was said to have cried throughout the wedding day. English heritage uses the cautious word reportedly. Christie's describes public signs that observers read as crying. The accounts agree that distress became part of the public memory. They do not grant us permission to invent what she said in private, or to describe emotions no witness recorded. The press also produced satire. A cartoon represented the bride as restrained by the force behind the match. The drawing was not a photograph. It was public commentary. Its value lies in showing that contemporaries did not universally accept the wedding as a perfect romance. Some recognized the transaction, and the pressure well enough to turn them into an image. The spectacle worked, because a society wedding allowed money to appear as romance, and hierarchy to appear as destiny. Flowers, clothing, ritual, and crowds made the alliance seem natural. The settlement remained off-stage. Its terms had been negotiated before the bride reached the altar. The ritual did not create the financial logic. It blessed and publicized it. St. Thomas's also matters because the later annulment controversy returned to the authority of the original ceremony. In 1926, the Episcopal Bishop of New York defended the marriage as one solemnized in his church and under American law. He objected to a Vatican tribunal declaring it null after divorce and remarriage. His argument shows how one ceremony could belong to several institutions at once. The family saw an alliance. The church saw vows. Civil law saw a marriage. The settlement saw a condition that had now been fulfilled. Consuelo and the Duke did not need to agree on the meaning of the day for the institutions to proceed. The Church recorded the union. Society recognized the title. Trustees followed the settlement. Newspapers declared the event. Once these systems moved together, personal reluctance could be absorbed into public completion. This is why visible compliance cannot settle the question of consent. A person can stand where ceremony requires and still describe pressure later. At the same time, a historian must distinguish later testimony from a record made on the day. The evidence here is cumulative. Consuelo's objection appears in institutional biography. Her memoir remembers resistance. The annulment basis later reported parental pressure. The Episcopal bishop offered a counterclaim about the clergy's understanding. The responsible conclusion is not that uncertainty erases pressure. It is that pressure must be described through the records that assert and contest it. After the ceremony, the title changed immediately. Consuelo became Duchess of Marlborough. The public transformation was complete. Her wealth was now discussed in relation to Blenheim. Her future children would be discussed in relation to succession. Her movements would be read as the actions of a duchess rather than only a Vanderbilt daughter. This change in name demonstrates the asymmetry of dynastic marriage. The bride entered the groom's title and house. Her family money traveled with her, but the palace did not become Vanderbilt Palace. The Marlborough identity absorbed the financial support while retaining its own name. New money preserved old branding. That phrase may sound modern, but the mechanism is old. Institutions survive by incorporating resources without surrendering the symbols that make them valuable. Blenheim could accept American capital because the capital helped the palace continue to look Marlborough. The more effectively the restoration worked, the less visible the external support became. A successful repair allows the building to appear uninterrupted. The wedding, therefore, performed two acts of concealment. It hid negotiation inside romance. It hid external finance inside hereditary continuity. The bride's title made the exchange seem complete, as if she had always been moving toward this role. The restored palace would later make the money seem native to the house, as if the stones had simply endured. Neither appearance was entirely false. The marriage was legally completed, and the palace did endure. But appearances leave out causation. Consuelo's later account asks us to restore choice to the wedding. The financial record asks us to restore American money to the palace. Both corrections lead away from myth and toward mechanism. When the church doors closed and the public ceremony ended, the story did not become private. It moved into a larger institution. Consuelo was now tied to Blenheim's calendar, household, family, and future. The settlement had crossed from possibility into operation. A marriage that made newspaper spectacle in New York was about to become stonework, books, furniture, wages, and ceremony in England. Becoming Duchess of Marlborough meant entering a role designed before Consuelo was born. The role existed in rooms, precedents, household practice, charitable expectation, family memory, and the demand for heirs. A person could shape the role, but she could not begin with a blank page. Blenheim was the role's largest physical expression. The palace told every visitor that the Duchess belonged to a lineage. Portraits connected the present family to earlier generations. Staterooms turned hospitality into rank. Dining arrangements ordered people by position. The library connected the household to learning and memory. Gardens extended command beyond walls. Even when no formal event was taking place, the building instructed its occupants. For an American bride, this world offered prestige and restriction together. Her family wealth gave her importance. Her title placed her inside rules she had not written. She could be displayed as proof that American money and British nobility had joined successfully. She could also find that the house's needs came before her preference. The common version of the story says she crossed the Atlantic and encountered a cold palace. Cold may work as metaphor, but it is not necessary. The documented reality is more precise. Blenheim was expensive, historically burdened, and in need of work. The Duke's financial position made the settlement valuable. The NPG says the money supported restoration, furnishings, and the library. The house was not a passive setting. It was one of the principal beneficiaries of the match. That fact changes how we interpret the role of Duchess. Consuelo was not only invited to inhabit Blenheim, her marriage helped make Blenheim inhabitable on the scale expected of a ducal palace. The institution demanded that she perform status while drawing financial strength from the fortune attached to her. A great household depends on visible and invisible labor. The Duchess occupies the visible summit of one part of that hierarchy. Below and around her work secretaries, housekeepers, footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners, coachmen, craftsmen, laundresses, and laborers. The exact staff lists changed over time, and this story does not claim a complete Blenheim roster for a particular day. The larger point is structural. Rank is made visible by coordinated work. The settlement touched that world indirectly. Income available to the household could support repairs and objects. Repairs required survey, materials, transport, skill, and supervision. Furnishings required purchase, cleaning, placement, and care. Books required acquisition, binding, cataloging, and protection. The money's journey from trust to finished room passed through many hands. Those hands rarely appear in the marriage story. Society pages focus on bride and duke. Palace histories focus on architects and owners. Yet the promise that Consuelo's fortune restored Blenheim cannot be repaid without acknowledging workers. Money does not repair stone by itself. It purchases time, tools, knowledge, and labor. The same is true of ceremony. A dinner at Blenheim required planning, heat, food, linen, silver, and cleaning. Guests saw effortless order because servants absorbed disorder. The Duchess herself performed within that system. Her clothing, schedule, introductions, and household responsibilities were part of the visible product. She was privileged within the hierarchy and constrained by the role it assigned. This is an important distinction. Privilege does not prevent coercion. Constraint does not erase privilege. Consuelo was not a servant at Blenheim. She possessed wealth, title, and access unavailable to the workers who maintained the house. At the same time, those advantages did not automatically give her freedom over the marriage that created them. The story becomes weaker when it tries to make her either powerless in every respect or powerful in every respect. Institutional position is layered. She could have authority over household matters and still face pressure from family and marriage. She could benefit from a settlement and still object to the union. She could hold a title that elevated her in public while feeling that the title had been purchased through her. Her two sons added another layer. The Blenheim family tree records John and Ivor. Their births secured the immediate continuation of the line. In dynastic language, children are not only family members, they are succession. Their existence linked Vanderbilt ancestry and money to the future dukedom. The phrase heir and spare is often associated with Consuelo in later accounts. Whether or not one repeats the phrase, the institution's logic is clear. One son could inherit. A second reduced the risk that illness or death would break the line. The private fact of motherhood became a public answer to dynastic uncertainty. This does not mean every moment with her children was calculated. It means the system placed meaning on their births beyond family affection. Once again, personal life and institutional need occupied the same space. The palace needed money. The title needed succession. The marriage provided both. The public could therefore judge the union successful long before knowing whether the spouses had built a satisfying shared life. The house was being restored. The line had sons. The Duchess performed her role. The settlement functioned. Institutional measures of success can remain positive while human measures fail. That split is one of the deepest lessons of the story. Organizations often call an arrangement successful when the desired assets have moved, the role is filled, and continuity is secured. The people inside may experience the same arrangement differently. Blenheim's endurance is real. So is the later collapse of the marriage. One result does not cancel the other. Together they reveal what the institution valued most. What exactly did the Vanderbilt money change at Blenheim? The safest answer comes from the National Portrait Gallery. It says the dowry was used to restore the palace and replenish the furnishings and library. That sentence establishes 3 categories: fabric, objects, books. Each category served a different function. The fabric kept the palace standing and usable. Furnishings made rooms perform their ceremonial and domestic purposes. The library connected the household to education, taste, ancestry, and public seriousness. Together, they rebuilt the image of a functioning great house. The phrase used to restore does not provide an invoice list. It does not tell us which stone, chair, or volume came from which payment. We should not manufacture that precision. Historical money moves through accounts. Funds mix. Projects extend across years. Owners borrow, sell, inherit, and redirect income. A large settlement may create capacity without paying one labeled bill from beginning to end. This boundary does not weaken the title. The source explicitly connects Vanderbilt wealth to restoration. The title says Blenheim needed her fortune, not that every later improvement came only from the first trust. The distinction keeps the causal claim strong and honest. Consider the fabric first. A palace at Blenheim's scale contains roofs, drains, windows, chimneys, masonry, floors, plaster, joinery, and decorative surfaces. Failure in one system can damage several others. Water entering through a roof reaches ceilings, wood, paintings, and textiles. A blocked drain can undermine stone. A damaged window changes heat and moisture. Maintenance is a chain, not a single repair. Restoration money therefore buys prevention as well as visible beauty. The most important work may leave no dramatic afterimage. A secure roof simply stops being noticed. Dry walls look ordinary. Sound masonry permits every other part of the palace to continue. The better the work, the easier it is for later visitors to imagine the building survived without interruption. Furnishings operate differently. They shape how a room is read. A vast space with too few objects looks depleted. A formal room needs scale, arrangement, and material richness. Chairs, tables, carpets, curtains, lighting, silver, and art do more than provide comfort. They stage authority. When the NPG says the furnishings were replenished, it suggests that the palace's interior completeness had required renewed investment. Replenishment may involve acquiring objects, recovering quality, or replacing what previous financial strain had dispersed. The source does not ask us to imagine one dramatic shopping expedition. It describes a longer process by which rooms regained the material density expected of them. The library adds an intellectual dimension. A dynastic library is both tool and symbol. Its books may support study, administration, politics, travel, religion, and leisure. Their bindings and arrangement create a visual field of continuity. Missing shelves or neglected volumes make decline visible in a different way from broken stone. To replenish the library was to repair the family's claim to cultivated memory. Books also reveal how money and time interact. A library is accumulated. Its authority depends on duration. New money can purchase old books, but the resulting collection is presented as part of a continuing house. This is another form of absorption. American capital could help rebuild a British aristocratic past. The same absorption occurred in the visual culture of the family. Portraits of Consuelo entered the palace and national collections. A Sargent image could represent her as a duchess within the aesthetic language of aristocracy. English heritage has recently used such portraits to challenge the narrow dollar princess stereotype. The image that once confirmed belonging can now prompt questions about the person behind the title. Objects are not neutral witnesses. They are commissioned, selected, placed, and interpreted. A portrait may idealize. A settlement may restrict. A palace may conceal the source of funds. A memoir may reshape memory. Historical truth emerges by comparing them. At Blenheim, the building and the paper point toward the same mechanism. The settlement made wealth available. The palace received restoration. The objects and books were replenished. The Duke's inherited obligation acquired new financial support. Consuelo's name became attached to that support. The work also changed the future. Restoration is a gift to later occupants and visitors, even when the original motive is dynastic pride. A repaired building can survive long enough to acquire new meanings. A replenished library can be studied by people the purchaser never imagined. The benefit is real, so is the cost hidden in the transaction that financed it. This tension prevents a simple verdict. It would be false to say that nothing good came from the money, because the marriage was troubled. It would be equally false to point to beautiful rooms and declare the arrangement justified. Historical consequences do not balance like a moral account. A palace can be preserved through a union that denied a woman the choice she later claimed. The preservation does not erase the denial. The denial does not make the craftsmanship unreal. That is why the word needed in the title is so useful. Need describes the institution, not a moral right. Blenheim needed cash to continue at the scale its owners demanded. That need created pressure for a solution. Consuelo's fortune provided one. Whether the house deserved the solution is a different question from whether the mechanism worked. The mechanism did work. Stone, furniture, and books received investment. The family line continued. The marriage later ended. The physical consequences remained. In that sense, Blenheim became the most durable clause in the settlement, even though the palace itself was not a line of legal text. Restoration stories often place an owner in the foreground and reduce workers to a verb. The Duke restored, the Duchess improved, the family replenished. But no owner cuts stone merely by authorizing payment. The phrase "her fortune rebuilt Blenheim" points to a chain of labor. Someone had to inspect damage. Someone had to estimate cost. Someone had to choose materials. Someone had to negotiate delivery. Masons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, metalworkers, glaziers, upholsterers, bookbinders, gardeners, cleaners, clerks, and carriers transformed money into physical change. The exact participants depended on the project. Their collective role is not speculation. It is what restoration means in practice. This labor connects the palace to the railroad fortune in a way that portraits cannot. Vanderbilt wealth came from a vast American system built by workers, managers, investors, and public infrastructure. At Blenheim, portions of that financial power purchased another field of labor. Capital generated through industrial networks crossed the Atlantic in legal form and reappeared as craft within an aristocratic estate. The distance between those workers was enormous. A person maintaining track in the United States did not know which chair might later be acquired for an English palace. A mason at Blenheim did not see the full path of the securities behind a payment. Yet financial history connects them. The settlement allowed value produced in one system to preserve another. This does not mean the trust can be traced to every wage. It means that institutional sources connect the dowry to restoration, and restoration requires labor. The inference is direct but bounded. We can honor the work without inventing names or scenes. The invisibility of workers served the palace's image. Great houses were designed to present effortless command. Construction might be celebrated when it produced a new facade, but routine maintenance was meant to disappear. A repaired crack should look as though it had never opened. A polished floor should not display the hand that polished it. A formal garden should look controlled, even though living growth resists control every day. Servants inside the house performed the same kind of disappearance. They created order while remaining outside the main family story. The Duchess's role depended on their work. Her public appearance could seem natural because clothing was prepared, rooms were cleaned, food was cooked, carriages were arranged, messages were delivered, and guests were managed. This hierarchy complicates any attempt to describe Consuelo only as oppressed. She stood at the top of a labor system that constrained others more severely in material terms. Her title carried authority. The story must hold that fact alongside the pressure within her marriage. Human beings can be constrained in one structure and privileged in another. The settlement also sat above workers. Trustees and principals directed capital. Owners selected projects. Workers converted decisions into results. The palace's survival depended on all levels, but public credit flowed upward. This pattern is common in institutional history. Names attached to wealth become names attached to achievement. For Dynasty and Dust, the repair crew matters because the physical result is the proof. Arm A of the visual package focuses on workers and scaffolding, rather than another portrait of Consuelo. That choice does not remove her. It shows what her money was made to do. The human figure becomes labor rather than ornament. The visual distinction is important. Episode 1 centered a woman inside Biltmore holding keys, an image of access and responsibility. Episode 2 cannot simply replace the face and palace. Its mechanism is different. The strongest physical image is not a duchess looking distressed. It is a great facade under repair, with the settlement's consequence made visible. This choice also avoids pretending that we possess a photograph of a private wedding emotion that explains everything. Restoration is documented. Labor is necessary to it. Scaffolding, stone, tools, and facade create a truthful visual metaphor for capital becoming continuity. The worker's presence changes the moral scale. The marriage was negotiated among elites. Its money supported labor beyond the family. Wages may have sustained households. Skills may have preserved art. Again, those benefits do not justify pressure on Consuelo. They reveal that consequences spread in more than one direction. A system can produce good work through unequal arrangements. That is one reason simple moral arithmetic fails. The craft deserves admiration. The source of funds deserves scrutiny. The workers deserve recognition. Consuelo deserves to be remembered as a person rather than the account from which payments flowed. The Duke deserves to be understood as an owner acting under dynastic obligation, without allowing obligation to excuse every choice. The palace gathers these layers into one object. Look at a restored surface and several histories meet. The architect's design, the worker's hand, the owner's decision, the trustee's payment, the bride's settlement, the family's ambition, the visitor's admiration. None is the whole surface. Together, they explain why it exists. Dust is useful here. Dust settles equally on inherited stone and newly purchased furniture. It reveals that grandeur still requires cleaning. Dynasty promises continuity. Dust proves maintenance. Consuelo's fortune entered the space between them. It paid toward the continual work required to make a dynasty look untouched by time. The ninth Duke's legacy at Blenheim extended beyond interior repair. Blenheim Palace's own educational material records major formal garden work under him with the French landscape architect Achille Duchesne. It places Duchesne's work across the early decades of the 20th century and names the Great Courtyard, the Italian Garden, and the water terraces among the results. These dates require care. Some work began after the marriage, some continued after Consuelo, and the Duke had separated. The water terraces belong to a later phase, from the middle of the 1920s into the early 1930s. It would be false to present every garden feature as a direct purchase from the original dowry or as Consuelo's personal project. The projects are still relevant because they show the scale of the Ninth Duke's program. The institutional need was not a single emergency patch. It was an ambition to reorder and restore the palace environment across decades. The Vanderbilt settlement helped create financial strength at the beginning of that era. Later money, later relationships, and later decisions also mattered. This boundary helps us see how wealth changes institutional possibility. A large settlement may not pay for every later element. It can stabilize an owner, repair core assets, replenish interiors, and make further ambition imaginable. Causation is sometimes a platform rather than a receipt. The Great Courtyard demonstrates that restoration can mean recovering an earlier formal intention. The Italian garden and water terraces demonstrate that restoration can blend with new design. The ninth Duke did not simply freeze Blenheim at one date. He selected which historical qualities to emphasize and which modern interventions could support them. Landscape work is especially revealing because it turns money into controlled time. Trees grow. Hedges require repeated cutting. Water systems must be maintained. Stone terraces weather. A garden that appears complete is actually a sequence of recurring tasks. The finished design is an agreement to continue spending. That agreement mirrors the settlement. Both extend authority into the future. The legal document directs income and succession. The landscape plan directs growth and labor. Each tries to make uncertainty obey a design. Neither can succeed without people continuing to enforce it. The water terraces now form part of the ninth Duke's visible legacy. Blenheim's own page describes their creation and connection to Duchess. It also notes decorative features associated with the Duke's second Duchess. That detail quietly shows how palace history accumulates across relationships. Consuelo's marriage and money belong to one phase. The Duke's later marriage and later projects belong to another. The house absorbed them all into one visitor route. Visitors rarely encounter that chronology in a single view. They see the palace and gardens as a total composition. Features separated by years appear simultaneous. The landscape smooths the sequence, just as Dynasty smooths changes in family. Historical interpretation has to put time back. Putting time back means saying that the restoration associated with Vanderbilt money was real, and that not every ninth Duke project can be assigned to it. It means recognizing that the marriage lasted long enough to produce sons and institutional change, while the spouses later separated. It means seeing that the palace continued after their union ended. The palace's continuity can make individual lives seem brief. Consuelo lived for decades after leaving the marriage. The Duke continued at Blenheim. Their sons carried the family line. Garden projects advanced. Portraits remained. A visitor may encounter all of them as names attached to rooms and objects, without sensing how sharply their paths diverged. This is why chronology is an ethical tool. It prevents the house from claiming every person as a permanent part of one harmonious family story. Consuelo belonged to Blenheim's history. She did not belong to the marriage forever. Divorce and remarriage changed her life, even though the palace retained her portrait and descendants. The landscape also clarifies the meaning of legacy. A duke's legacy may be a terrace. A duchess's legacy may be narrated as the money that made restoration possible. A worker's legacy may be an unnamed wall that still stands. A legal document's legacy may be income converted into objects. Legacy is not the same as justice. It is what remains. What remains at Blenheim is extraordinary. That is precisely why the financing deserves attention. When a building survives beautifully, the systems behind survival can vanish. The stronger the visual effect, the easier it is to accept the official family line and move on. Consuelo's story interrupts that ease. The interruption does not ask us to dislike the gardens. It asks us to see them in time. Before the terraces, there was the financial weakness of the inherited estate. Before the restoration, there was the settlement. Before the settlement, there was negotiation. Before the ceremony, there was an objection. Behind every finished view, there were choices. Once time is restored, Blenheim no longer looks like a timeless gift. It looks like a project repeatedly financed, argued over, repaired, and reinterpreted. Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage was one of the decisive points at which new resources entered that project. The palace outlasted the marriage because the institution was designed to do exactly that. Dynastic portraits ask viewers to believe that a family exists as one stable body. A duke, a duchess, and their children can be arranged into a composition where clothing, posture, and setting communicate continuity. The resulting image may be visually true to the sitters and institutionally misleading about the relationships among them. John Singer Sargent's family portrait of the Marlboroughs belongs to this world of representation. Christie's places it near the end of the period before the couple formally separated. The portrait shows a family whose public structure remained intact. The image cannot tell us the private condition of the marriage. It can tell us what the family needed to present. The sons made that presentation especially powerful. The Blenheim family tree records John, born in 1897, and Ivor, born in 1898. The elder son stood in the line of succession. The younger provided another male descendant. Their presence connected the Vanderbilt marriage to the future of the dukedom. This was not a minor result. Before the sons, succession carried uncertainty. After them, the marriage had produced the next generation of the house. A family portrait could therefore display a solution to two institutional problems at once. The American fortune had helped strengthen the estate. The American bride had become mother to the heirs. To describe this is not to reduce motherhood to succession. It is to identify the meaning the institution placed on the children. Consuelo's relationship with her sons was a human bond. Blenheim's relationship with them was dynastic. Both existed simultaneously. Public representation tends to favor the dynastic view because it is easier to paint and archive. Titles, dates, and lines of descent fit into catalogs. Affection, conflict, distance, and change resist the same neatness. A family tree records that a marriage occurred and children were born. It does not record whether breakfast was comfortable. Objects sometimes preserve hints of the other story. Blenheim Palace today describes a large silver centerpiece and repeats a story that Consuelo preferred to have it on the dining table between herself and the Duke. The palace itself calls this a story. It should be treated as one. The object exists. The attribution survives. The scene is not independently proved simply because it is memorable. The anecdote is useful if handled carefully. A centerpiece made to display family victory allegedly became a barrier in a strained marriage. Symbolically, it is almost too perfect. That perfection is a warning. Historical stories often survive because they compress a relationship into one image. The responsible narrator labels the compression rather than presenting it as verified observation. The family portrait and the centerpiece point in opposite directions. One arranges the household into unity. The other is said to have divided two people at the same table. Between them lies the problem of evidence. Official images show what an institution wanted remembered. Anecdotes show what later audiences found meaningful. Neither alone supplies the whole life. Consuelo's public role also cannot be measured only by the marriage's happiness. A duchess could perform duties, host, travel, support causes, raise children, and influence social networks even within a difficult union. The institutional biographies and later memoir establish that her life contained more than the wedding. English Heritage's curatorial work insists on this broader view for American heiresses as a group. The temptation to use reported unhappiness as the only lens can reproduce another kind of erasure. If every action is interpreted as evidence of victimhood, Consuelo loses agency after the wedding. If every public success is used to deny pressure, the institution excuses itself. A full account allows both adaptation and constraint. She learned the role well enough to be represented within it. She produced heirs. She became a recognizable figure in British society. These outcomes do not prove she chose the marriage. They show that people continue to act within arrangements they did not design. That insight matters far beyond aristocracy. Institutions often mistake performance for consent. A person who carries out a role competently may still oppose the conditions that place them there. Success at adaptation does not validate the pressure that made adaptation necessary. The Marlborough family could point to the sons, the restored palace, and the public image as evidence that the match had worked. From the institution's perspective, it had. The title continued. The house improved. The family appeared complete. From Consuelo's later perspective, the question was not only whether the institution worked, it was whether she had been allowed to choose. These are different measures, and the history must not merge them. Institutional success is not personal consent. Material legacy is not marital fulfillment. A portrait is not a verdict. Once those distinctions are clear, the image of the family becomes more interesting, not less. It becomes evidence of what Dynasty can arrange on a canvas, even when life has already begun to separate outside the frame. Consuelo and the Duke separated in the early years of the new century. Christie's gives 1906 for the formal separation. The National Portrait Gallery records the later divorce in 1921. These dates establish a long distance between the wedding and the legal end of the union. It would be easy to fill that distance with confident explanation. Later biographies, memoirs, and society accounts offer stories about incompatibility, other attachments, coldness, duty, and resentment. Some may be well supported in fuller archival research. For this episode, the responsible approach is narrower. The couple separated. The marriage later ended in divorce. The result is clear, even when private causation remains mixed. This boundary protects Consuelo from being turned into a character whose inner life a narrator claims to own. It also protects the Duke from motives constructed only to sharpen a villain. The documented structure is strong enough. A union that had delivered money, title, and heirs did not continue as a shared marriage. Separation reveals the difference between a relationship and the systems attached to it. The spouses could live apart while the family line continued. The palace could retain the benefits of restoration. The settlement could continue under its terms. Portraits could remain on walls. Children could belong to both parents and to the succession. Institutional consequences did not reverse when the household divided. This durability was one purpose of settlement law. A financial instrument prepared before marriage tries to survive events that emotion cannot predict. Death, debt, children, and disagreement are treated as contingencies. The document's success is measured by continuity. It does not care whether the marriage feels whole. For Consuelo, Separation opened a space between title and daily life. She remained connected to the Marlborough history, but the role no longer described every part of her existence. Later divorce and remarriage made that separation legally and socially visible. For Blenheim, the separation did not undo the past. Stone cannot return money. Books do not leave shelves because a marriage fails. A restored room continues to perform continuity, even when the couple associated with its restoration lives apart. The house preserved the transaction more effectively than the marriage preserved the relationship. This is one reason country houses can create misleading narratives. Their rooms gather objects from different decades and present them together. A visitor sees one family story. In reality, marriages form and break. Money enters and leaves. Heirs disagree. Servants change, and owners revise earlier choices. The house remains still while the people move. Consuelo's departure from the shared marriage also changes the meaning of the title, Duchess of Marlborough. A title can continue to identify a person historically, even after daily connection to the role changes. Catalogs preserve it because it locates her in a known family. Yet her later name, Balson, records another life. The shift in names is not a footnote. It shows the limits of dynastic possession. Blenheim could retain portraits and descendants. It could not contain her entire future. She married Jacques Balson after the divorce. Southampton History Museum traces her later connection to him and to life beyond the palace. The 1926 church controversy also notes that both former spouses had remarried. That later life does not need to be idealized in order to matter. It proves change. Consuelo was not fixed forever. At the altar in 1895, she aged, reflected, formed new relationships, and eventually wrote her own account. The image of the crying bride became one chapter rather than the final frame. This is an ethical correction to popular history. Tragic wedding stories often stop where the emotional image is strongest. The woman remains young, veiled, and powerless forever. Her later years become an epilogue of a few sentences. A longer view restores time to her. The longer view also clarifies consequence. The marriage lasted in law for years after separation. Divorce required a formal process. Remarriage created new legal and religious complications. The annulment followed later and reopened the meaning of the original consent. A private decision to live apart, therefore unfolded into a sequence of public institutional actions. Each action involved a different authority. The household managed separation. Civil law managed divorce. New ceremonies recognized remarriage. A church tribunal addressed validity. An episcopal bishop contested jurisdiction and reasoning. Newspapers carried the dispute. Consuelo's memoir later offered personal memory. History accumulated layer upon layer rather than replacing one account with another. The palace stood through all of it. Its continuity is almost indifferent. That indifference is not cruelty because a building has no will. It is institutional design. The estate exists to outlast individual disruption. The trouble begins when that design is treated as the highest good. Consuelo's story asks what gets sacrificed when continuity becomes the measure of success. In 1895, her family's ambition and the Duke's need converged on a marriage. By the time of separation, the palace had gained resources and the line had heirs. The institution had taken what it required. Her leaving did not make it give anything back. Divorce ended the civil marriage, but it did not settle the historical argument. In 1926, a church annulment generated a public controversy over consent, jurisdiction, and memory. The dispute is valuable because it exposes how institutions defend their own authority when the same marriage belongs to more than one system. The marriage had been celebrated in an Episcopal church in New York. It had legal standing in the United States. The couple had lived as husband and wife, had 2 children, later divorced, and then remarried other people. A Vatican tribunal nevertheless declared the marriage null in a religious process. The public explanation reported at the time was that parental pressure had been exercised and that Consuelo had not acted with free consent. That reasoning aligns with the objection recorded in later institutional biography and with the conflict described in her memoir. Yet the decree did not pass without challenge. William Manning, the Episcopal Bishop of New York, addressed his diocese on the matter. His message attacked both the Vatican Tribunal's authority and its conclusion. He argued that the original clergy had taken care over consent, and that the later claim of pressure contradicted the long civil history of the marriage. His language was forceful and openly institutional. Manning's message is not a neutral account of Consuelo's experience. He was defending the authority of his church and the validity of a ceremony performed within it. That interest does not make his evidence worthless. It tells us how to read it. He preserved the counterclaim that clergy believed the bride had consented. He also preserved the reported basis of the annulment he opposed. The two claims can coexist in the historical record without becoming equal in every respect. Clergy may have believed they had obtained consent. Consuelo may still have experienced family pressure. A formal answer at an altar does not reveal every force that produced it. The later legal and religious language tried to make a complicated human situation fit a rule. Consent is especially difficult when authority operates inside a family. A stranger's threat may leave obvious evidence. A parent's control can be woven through dependence, affection, fear of disgrace, and long training in obedience. The person may comply without the scene matching a court's narrow image of force. Later testimony may describe the experience more fully than the ceremony could. At the same time, historians must resist turning the later annulment into proof of every dramatic story told about the wedding. The decree addressed validity under a religious system. It did not produce a complete transcript of family life. We can say that pressure formed the reported basis. We can say the Episcopal bishop disputed it. We can say Consuelo later described resistance. We cannot claim access to every conversation. The controversy also shows how remarriage changed the stakes. Both former spouses had entered new unions. The Duke's religious position gave annulment practical meaning beyond historical curiosity. Manning believed the process threatened the authority of the original church and civil order. His response therefore defended more than one marriage. It defended a boundary between institutions. Consuelo's first marriage became a site on which churches argued about jurisdiction. Her consent, already contested within the family story, became evidence in a struggle between authorities. Once again, her personal history served an institutional purpose. This pattern echoes the original settlement. Before the wedding, families translated her future into financial clauses. Decades later, churches translated her past into legal and religious categories. In both moments, institutions spoke with confidence about the meaning of her life. Her own memoir arrived as another voice, powerful but late. The annulment did not remove the sons. It did not unrestore the palace. It did not dissolve the settlement's historical effects. A declaration of nullity operates within doctrine, but material history remains. This is why institutional records can contradict each other without undoing consequence. The civil marriage was real enough to organize wealth, title, children, and property. The later religious judgment was real enough to reshape status within a church. Consuelo's remembered resistance was real enough to demand attention. Manning's protest was real enough to reveal contemporary disagreement. History contains all of them. For the viewer, this complexity may feel less satisfying than a verdict. A documentary title promises an answer, and the answer is clear where the evidence is clear. Blenheim needed money. The marriage settlement supplied it. The marriage later ended. The coercion question is supported by Consuelo's objection, memoir, and the reported annulment basis. But the original church's representatives disputed the conclusion. That is not evasion. It is the shape of the record. The larger implication is that records do not simply preserve truth. They preserve contests over authority. A palace catalog preserves dynastic continuity. A settlement preserves financial rules. A memoir preserves remembered experience. A bishop's address preserves institutional defense. The historian's task is to keep each voice in its proper place. When that is done, Consuelo appears neither as a silent object nor as an all-knowing narrator of the past. She appears as a person whose life crossed systems that recorded her for different reasons. The conflict among those records is part of what happened to her. The Glitter and the Gold was published in 1952, more than 50 years after Consuelo became Duchess of Marlborough. The distance gave her knowledge the young bride could not possess. She knew the marriage would end. She knew Blenheim's later history. She knew her mother, children, former husband, and second marriage from the perspective of age. That hindsight made the memoir possible and shaped its form. Memoir is often asked to perform two incompatible tasks. Readers want the intimacy of memory and the certainty of an official record. A memoir can offer the first. It cannot always offer the second. Its authority lies in personal experience, not perfect chronology. Consuelo's account deserves particular weight on the question of how she understood her own choices. No institutional summary can replace her voice. When she remembered asserting a right to choose her husband, she identified the conflict in terms that mattered to her. The responsible phrase is she later remembered, not she secretly thought in a moment no source records. That distinction may sound small, but it protects the story from historical fiction. It lets the viewer hear her claim without pretending the narrator stood in the room. It also acknowledges that memory is created after experience. The older Consuelo interpreted the younger Consuelo. Her title for the memoir is revealing. Glitter names surface brilliance. Gold names the material value beneath it. The title suggests that appearance and wealth were inseparable in her world. It also suggests a difference between them. Glitter catches the eye. Gold carries weight. Blenheim can be read through the same pair. The palace glitters through ceremony, art, and design. The settlement supplied gold in the broader sense of financial power. The marriage connected appearance to capital. Consuelo's life occupied the connection. The memoir's survival changed her historical position. Without it, later audiences would rely more heavily on family papers, church arguments, portraits, and institutional summaries. With it, the bride later speaks as an author. She selects the beginning, judges the past, and names what mattered. Authorship does not erase the archive. It enters the archive as another kind of evidence. The memoir can be compared with NPG biography, Blenheim records, legal context, and the 1926 controversy. Where sources converge, confidence grows. Where they differ, the difference becomes part of the story. The convergence on resistance is significant. The NPG says her objection was overruled. English Heritage refers to the loveless marriage and reported tears. The annulment basis was reported as parental pressure and lack of free consent. Consuelo's memoir remembers a claim to choose. None of these sources is identical. Together they establish more than a rumor. The remaining uncertainty concerns detail and degree. How did pressure operate on each day? What did each family member believe? Which private threats or promises were made? How did Consuelo's feelings change after marriage? A 90-minute documentary cannot resolve questions the record itself leaves open. It should not pretend to. The memoir also reminds us that the story did not end at Blenheim. Consuelo lived long enough to watch the world that created her marriage change. British aristocratic power shifted. Great houses faced new economic pressures. Women gained wider legal and political rights. Public attitudes toward divorce changed. The very idea that a daughter should serve as a route to a title became easier to criticize openly. She also lived under another name. Her marriage to Jacques Balsan belongs to the later biography. Southampton History Museum preserves that connection in local history, showing that her life reached beyond English ducal identity. To recognize that later chapter is to return ownership of time to her. Popular culture often calls her the real inspiration for fictional heiresses. That comparison may bring new viewers to the history, but the documentary must move in the other direction. Fiction can combine people, invent dialogue, and create a clean emotional arc. History must separate them again. Consuelo was not a template. She was a person with a specific family, settlement, palace, marriage, and record. The memoir is therefore not valuable because it makes the story more dramatic. The story needs no invention. It is valuable because it changes who gets to interpret the glitter. Society pages admired the wedding. Palace histories admired the restoration. Church authorities debated the marriage. Consuelo described what the arrangement meant from inside her own remembered life. Her book did not take the money back from Blenheim. It did something different. It attached a voice to a transfer that architecture could otherwise make anonymous. The palace could display the result. The memoir named the human route by which the result had been obtained. This is one of history's quiet forms of restitution. It does not reverse an event. It restores a subject to the sentence. Instead of saying, Vanderbilt money restored Blenheim, we can say that the money came through Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage, a marriage she later described as contrary to the choice she wanted. The added clause changes the moral meaning of the stone. The phrase "dollar princess" makes a good headline because it contains a complete transaction in two words. Dollar means American wealth. Princess means European rank. The woman between them becomes both payment and prize. English Heritage's recent research asks audiences to look past that compression. It estimates that more than 400 wealthy American women married into the British aristocracy around the turn of the 20th century. It also stresses that the marriages were not all alike. Some women married for love. Some were not richer than their husbands. Many developed political, charitable, artistic, or public roles that the stereotype hides. Consuelo's marriage remains one of the strongest examples of financial exchange, because the settlement figure and Blenheim restoration are explicitly documented. That specificity should not be expanded into a rule for every woman. A pattern can be real without making every case identical. Why did the pattern exist? British titles retained social value. Some British estates faced costs that inherited income could not comfortably meet. American industrial families possessed new fortunes and sometimes wanted recognition within older hierarchies. Marriage was one of the few socially legitimate mechanisms for exchanging those assets. The women were not interchangeable, even when the market treated them as comparable. Family background, age, preference, wealth, education, and ambition differed. Husbands differed, houses differed, settlements differed. Some unions endured, others did not. The label flattens variation because its purpose is not explanation. Its purpose is quick recognition. The same flattening appears in palace tourism. A room may identify Consuelo as the American heiress whose money helped restore Blenheim. The statement is true. Without a fuller story, it can leave her as a financial footnote. Her later life, objection, memoir, and role as mother disappear behind the amount. The opposite error is to remove money from the story in order to protect her dignity. That would hide the mechanism and weaken the history. Respect does not require making the settlement less important. It requires showing that the person was more than the settlement. This balance gives the episode its structure. The title begins with the palace's need. The narration repays the financial claim immediately. It then follows the money through marriage, law, restoration, labor, and succession. At each stage, Consuelo returns not as ornament, but as the human connection. The approach also reveals class in both directions. Consuelo's family wealth gave her extraordinary privilege. The Marlborough title gave her extraordinary rank. Workers who maintained Blenheim had far less power than either spouse, yet elite privilege did not make the marriage freely chosen. Historical analysis does not require one ladder on which every person occupies a single permanent rung. Power changes with the question. Ask who controlled household staff, and the Duchess stood high. Ask who controlled the palace, and the Duke's inheritance mattered. Ask who controlled the settlement, and trustees and family terms mattered. Ask who controlled the match, and Consuelo's objection appears to have carried less force than her mother's ambition. Ask who controlled the later story, and memoir, museums, archives, and media each competed. This changing map of power is more accurate than a simple victim and villain frame. It does not soften pressure. It shows how pressure can act through people who themselves are constrained by class, gender, duty, law, and inheritance. The dollar princess label also hides the origin of the dollars. Railroad wealth did not appear by magic. It came from an industrial economy, from infrastructure, investment, labor, land, and political power. When that wealth entered Blenheim, the marriage carried more than family money. It carried the results of American economic transformation into the material preservation of British aristocracy. The exchange was therefore international and class-based. New fortunes sought legitimacy from old titles. Old titles sought liquidity from new fortunes. The Union helped both systems survive criticism. American wealth could look cultivated through association with Blenheim. British aristocracy could look continuous because American money repaired its setting. Consuelo's body and biography stood at the crossing. That is the hardest truth in the story. Institutions do not exchange abstractions by themselves. They use people. A daughter becomes alliance. A bride becomes capital route. A mother becomes strategist. A duke becomes caretaker of a title. Sons become succession. Once people are turned into functions, the system can call itself successful when the functions are performed. Consuelo's later voice interrupts that judgment. Her life insists that fulfillment of a role is not the same as choosing it. English heritage's caution about the stereotype provides the final boundary. The story should not end by declaring all transatlantic marriages fraudulent. It should end by showing exactly what happened here. A documented settlement of $2.5 million entered the Marlborough system. Institutional sources say the money restored Blenheim and replenished furnishings and library. Consuelo's objection was overruled. The marriage later separated, ended in divorce, and became the subject of an annulment dispute. She lived beyond it. That specific history is stronger than the label. It gives the dollar a path, the princess a name, the palace a need, and the marriage a consequence. What does Blenheim remember? It remembers owners through titles. It remembers designers through named gardens. It remembers battles through art and architecture. It remembers Consuelo through portraits, descendants, objects, and the history of restoration. The settlement itself is less visible than any of these. That imbalance is natural to a visitor experience. People come to see rooms and landscapes, not trust administration. Yet the invisible record is what explains the visible survival. Without financial history, restoration appears as taste. With financial history, it appears as allocation. Allocation means choosing one use over another. Money directed toward stone cannot be spent elsewhere. Income attached to a title supports one institution rather than another. A settlement written around marriage defines beneficiaries. Those choices are moral and political, even when expressed in legal language. The palace's need was real in the practical sense. Buildings decay, collections disperse, gardens overgrow. The Duke had inherited responsibility for a place that could not maintain itself. The solution was not inevitable. A family might sell land, reduce scale, open rooms, borrow, dispose of objects, or accept decline. In this case, marriage to an American heiress became a major answer. The solution was attractive because it preserved the institution's outward form. The Duke did not have to turn Blenheim into something unrelated to the Marlborough story. Vanderbilt money could repair the very symbols that made the title valuable. The exchange reinforced itself. For the Vanderbilt family, the title offered a different form of preservation. Industrial fortunes can be enormous and socially insecure. A ducal connection placed the family name inside an older lineage. Consuelo's sons carried both histories. Through them, railroad wealth became part of British hereditary succession. This was more than social climbing and more than estate rescue. It was a method by which elites adapted to economic change. British aristocracy did not simply vanish when landed income proved insufficient. It formed alliances with newer wealth. New wealth did not simply replace aristocracy. It purchased proximity and allowed old symbols to continue. The palace is therefore evidence of adaptation. Its continuity may look conservative, but the financing was modern and international. Shares, trusts, newspapers, transatlantic travel, and industrial capital supported a building that represented hereditary order. Tradition survived by using the tools of the new economy. Consuelo's marriage shows the human cost of that adaptation. Her family's capital could move because her marriage provided a socially accepted channel. The solution depended on treating her future as negotiable. The word cost must be used with care. We can document separation, divorce, annulment, objection, and her later account. We should not assign a single measurable quantity of suffering. Human experience is not another line in the settlement. The cost is visible in the loss of choice she described, and in the failure of the union to endure as a shared life. There was also a cost to historical memory. For decades, the catchy dollar princess story made the women resemble a group of decorative checks written to Europe. Their individual public work and later lives received less attention. Recent curatorial projects now try to recover complexity. Recovery is not the same as rehabilitation. The goal is not to prove that every heiress secretly controlled the arrangement or that every marriage was empowering. It is to restore variation and agency where evidence supports them. Consuelo's case includes real pressure. A fuller portrait does not remove it. The same principle applies to Alva. Ambition shaped the match. Later histories often make her the sole engine. Yet the marriage required the Duke's need, the father's money, lawyers, trustees, social intermediaries, church ceremony, and a culture that rewarded the outcome. Removing Alva would change the event, but blaming only her would leave the system intact. Systems become visible when we ask what would have happened if one person said no. Consuelo did object, according to the NPG. Her objection was overruled. That is the decisive institutional fact. The system had enough pressure to proceed, despite the preference of the person whose marriage made the exchange possible. The later annulment tried to answer whether that pressure invalidated consent. The church authorities disagreed. History need not reproduce their jurisdictional battle as its final word. It can say something simpler. A wedding ceremony is not proof that power was absent. A later memoir is not proof of every detail. The convergence of objection, remembered resistance, reported distress, and annulment rationale makes pressure a central documented part of the case. What Blenheim remembers materially is the successful side of the arrangement. Restored fabric, replenished rooms, books, gardens developed under the 9th Duke, sons in the family line. What Consuelo's later voice remembers is the contested side, choice. Put together, the two memories create a more complete monument. The palace is not only a monument to Marlborough victory and architectural ambition, it is also a monument to the capacity of institutions to convert a woman's marriage into durable capital. So why did Blenheim Palace need Consuelo Vanderbilt's fortune? Because an inherited palace can possess immense symbolic value and still lack the liquid income required to maintain its fabric, interiors, collection, library, household, and landscape. The ninth Duke inherited the title and the obligation. Consuelo's family possessed mobile industrial wealth. The marriage settlement connected them. How did the mechanism work? A $2.5 million dowry or settlement placed wealth into a controlled financial structure. The exact institutional summary does not expose every clause, and this account does not invent them. The general legal context shows why trustees and restrictions mattered. Capital could be preserved while income supported the marriage and dynasty. Through that structure, Vanderbilt money entered the Marlborough system. What did the money change? The National Portrait Gallery says it was used to restore Blenheim Palace and replenish its furnishings and library. Blenheim's own history records a broad program of work under the ninth Duke, including formal landscape projects with a Quai du Chêne. Not every later garden feature can be charged to the original settlement, but the financial transformation created capacity at the start of the era. Who performed the change? Workers did. Architects, craftsmen, gardeners, clerks, carriers, servants, and specialists converted financial permission into physical continuity. Their names are not all present in this story, but their labor is contained in the verb restored. What did the institution gain? Blenheim regained condition and completeness. The Marlborough line gained 2 sons. The family could present itself through repaired rooms, replenished collections, portraits, and succession. By its own measures, the arrangement delivered. What did Consuelo lose? Her later memoir framed the conflict as a right to choose her husband. The National Portrait Gallery says her objection was overruled. Reports of wedding day distress entered public memory. The later annulment was explained on grounds of parental pressure and lack of free consent, though the Episcopal bishop publicly contested that conclusion. The evidence does not permit invented scenes. It does establish that choice was at the heart of the dispute. What happened to the marriage? The couple separated, divorced, and remarried other people. A later religious annulment reopened the validity of the original union. The palace retained the financial and dynastic consequences. Consuelo lived beyond the marriage and later wrote her own account. What is the larger implication? Old institutions do not survive by age alone. They survive by finding new resources and converting them into the appearance of continuity. Blenheim's stone front concealed a modern adaptation. American railroad wealth supported British hereditary grandeur. The transfer was international, legal, and personal. The personal part is what architecture can erase. A repaired palace looks as though the family line remained unbroken. A settlement shows the break in economic self-sufficiency. Consuelo's memoir shows the break in the story of voluntary romance. The divorce shows the break in the union. The building gathered the benefits and smoothed the breaks. This is not an argument that Blenheim should have been allowed to decay. It is an argument that preservation has a history. Admiration becomes more honest when it includes financing, labor, and power. The palace is not less beautiful because American money helped restore it. The beauty becomes more legible. It is also not an argument that Consuelo should be remembered only for pressure. She was wealthy, titled, socially powerful, and later an author with a life beyond Blenheim. She occupied privilege and constraint at the same time. Her complexity is the boundary against turning the story into melodrama. Nor should every American heiress be forced into her pattern. English Heritage's research warns that transatlantic marriages varied widely. Some were loving. Some did not involve a richer bride. Some women used their positions to build important public lives. Consuelo's case is powerful because it is specific, not because it supplies a universal rule. The title-money exchange still matters as a system. More than 400 such marriages, in the institutional estimate, indicate repeated attraction between new American capital and old British rank. Each marriage had its own terms. Together, they show an aristocracy adapting rather than simply fading. Consuelo's settlement makes that adaptation visible in one house. Railroad wealth became stone repair. Capital became books and furniture. Marriage became income. Sons became succession. A bride's name became part of a palace's survival story. The sequence sounds mechanical because institutions are mechanical. They translate people into roles and wealth into functions. The human task of history is to reverse that translation. Put the person back where the system recorded only the function. At Blenheim, that means looking beyond Duchess of Marlborough as a title. It means seeing Consuelo Vanderbilt, born into a fortune, directed toward a ducal marriage, attached to a settlement, placed within a palace, made mother to heirs, later separated, divorced, remarried, and finally heard through her own remembered account. It means looking beyond the Duke as a cold symbol. He was the holder of an inherited office and a house whose needs shaped his choices. The obligation helps explain the financial motive. It does not make Consuelo's preference irrelevant. It means looking beyond Alva as a singular villain. Her ambition was central, but it worked because society rewarded the match and because lawyers, money, title, and family authority made it possible. It means looking beyond workers as background. Their skill turned the settlement's income into survival. The dynasty received the credit. The labor made the credit visible, and it means looking beyond the palace as scenery. Blenheim was an actor in the arrangement, not because stone has intention, but because the institution's needs directed human lives. The house required maintenance. The title required continuity. Those requirements created pressure for a marriage that served both. The answer, then, is not hidden in a secret room. It is written across the public surface. The restored palace is the receipt. The replenished library is the receipt. The family line is the receipt. The separation and annulment dispute are the human balance left outside the account. The next time Blenheim appears as a perfect background, hold both records in view. See the facade, then imagine the accounts that kept water out and craftsmen at work. See the library, then remember that replenishment required purchasing power. See the portraits, then ask what role each sitter was expected to perform. See the family tree, then notice how marriage converts a private relationship into a line of institutional succession. This way of looking does not drain wonder from the place. It replaces passive wonder with informed attention. A palace can be admired more seriously when its survival is not treated as magic. The repairs were chosen. The money came from somewhere. The labor belonged to people. The arrangement carried consequences. Consuelo's name is the point where those lines meet. She was not the only source of Marlborough wealth. And the original settlement was not the only money ever spent at Blenheim. Precision matters, yet the connection is direct enough to stand without exaggeration. Her dowry helped restore the palace and replenish its interiors. Her marriage made that transfer possible. Her later account and the annulment dispute preserve the conflict over whether the transfer was joined to a choice she freely made. The institution kept the strongest material evidence. Consuelo supplied the strongest personal counterweight. One without the other produces myth. Blenheim without Consuelo becomes timeless, aristocratic splendor. Consuelo without Blenheim becomes a tragic society anecdote. Put them together, and the mechanism emerges. A house with inherited status but insufficient cash joined itself to a family with immense cash but no British dukedom. The settlement solved the institutional problem. It did not solve the human one. Consuelo Vanderbilt did not simply bring glamour to Blenheim. Her marriage carried a financial instrument powerful enough to help restore the house. The house endured. The marriage did not. Between those outcomes lies the true story of Dynasty and Dust.